When you run away from fear, it gets larger. When you run towards fear, it gets smaller.
Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who address the challenges and best practices to deliver your message effectively. That might be one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. My guest today is Vince Poscente. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Vince. 1, he is a New York Times best-selling author of 8 books, including his latest, The Earthquake. 2, he's president of a board developer providing sound advice for high-growth companies. And 3, he claims that he does what the competition is not willing to do. Let's see how far we can push him today. Vince, welcome to Your Intended Message.
George, it's good to be a repeat guest. I'm very honored. To get past that first one, I think, is a tricky part. But here we are. Thank you.
And yes, welcome back. It was episode number 9 that you first appeared, and that was more than 2 years ago in September 2020. I remember that year?
Do you remember? I wonder why.
Memorable year, yeah. Vince, your latest book, The Earthquake, what's the key message there?
The opening line sets the stage, and that opening line is there's no linear way out of chaos. And what I think a book, or a documentary for that matter, should answer is a fundamental question. Well, then what is the way out of chaos, right? And that was a big challenge. I know you're an author as well, and just having, it's easy to write a bad book. Very easy. I mean, it's academic. You can just write a bad book. But can you write a book that has the reader go, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way? And so and also I'd written a book in the early 2000s called The Ant and the Elephant. And it's a very linear concept of ultimately saying, what are the steps necessary to get to your oasis, right? And the first question there is, well, what is your oasis? What is that place that gives you that emotional buzz? And so the ant is the metaphor for the conscious mind, the elephant, the subconscious mind. And having written that book, and, LeBron James quoted it in Sports Illustrated, FedEx used it as a leadership tool. I just ran into a university professor who used it in his classes in the University of Michigan, right? I mean, it's caught a life of its own, this Ant and the Elephant. It's a good book. It's a parable. How does the ant align on the back of the elephant when the elephant's headed east and it wants to go west? So how do you get your conscious intention going in the right direction when the subconscious agenda is going in the opposite direction? So it's a frustrating, human experience, if you will, in a parable format. But to answer your question about the earthquake, it is sometimes we experience a personal earthquake where we're incapacitated or we're catatonic or just paralyzed by fear of, maybe it's bankruptcy, maybe it's divorce, maybe it's a health scare, maybe it's losing a child. I mean, these personal earthquakes that can absolutely devastate us can create this environment of chaos. And therefore, how do you get through that chaos? How do you get unparalyzed and move forward? How do you engage in that way? And so I had taken from my own personal financial earthquake and then turned it into another parable about the ant and the elephant experiencing an earthquake at the very outset of the book. And then how do you get out of this chaos? What is this way to get there? And so that was the challenge of the book.
All right, and we'll explore the chaos, but before we do, I want to go back to the concept of the ant and the elephant being the subconscious, which suggests a concept that probably a lot of us don't want to admit, but we're not in control of our
We have
life.
the illusion of control, yes. Right. Yeah, people, if somebody asked you, how well do you know yourself? I mean, what would your answer be, right? Well, I know myself really well. But there's a saying, you don't know what you don't know.
Mm.
And this all sparked by research by a guy named Dr. Lee Poulos. And I don't know if you've met Dr. Poulos over the years, but he had some research that in a second of time, your conscious mind processes with 2,000 neurons. So right now, consciously you're aware of what I have to say. You're enjoying it. It might be something you wish somebody else would be listening to. You're looking at me thinking I look like Phil Donahue or the old man from Up, whatever you're thinking consciously. But in the same second, the subconscious mind is processing with 4 billion neurons. So from Poulos's research, I pulled a metaphor out of that, which is if an ant, the conscious mind, is on the back of the elephant, the subconscious mind, and the ant is making decisions on direction, you absolutely need the elephant to go in the same direction. And this is the human condition, right? You make an intention to go on a diet, but what if your subconscious mind is going, I don't think so, right? So you consciously want to lose weight and be more fit, but there might be a subconscious, below conscious agenda that is going in the different direction. The flip side, the absolute flip side of that is, what if 2,000 neurons and 4 billion neurons were headed in the same direction? So in both books, seeking the alignment is fundamental, but in an earthquake, that's easier said than done, because there's all sorts of fears going on.
Is fear our biggest earthquake?
Fear, it really is the aftershocks, right? Because when you have an earthquake, the fear starts to compound, if you will. There starts to be this fear of being hurt again. And it's all, most of it's at a very subconscious level. And fears can reignite childhood wounds. Fears can actually create all new narratives within the subconscious mind of what's going wrong and how deservability or the comfort zone shrinks, or there's all sorts of dysfunction that starts to create from an earthquake if you don't start to seek that alignment fairly quickly. Like, how are you going to pivot? Now, of course, if there's some sadness or depression or moments of just uncertainty, we want to avoid that pain, but that's where the solution is, right? The solution is going towards that. So getting your mind and heart wrapped around that dysfunction, that misalignment, that discord, and getting in the middle of it and feeling it and truly acknowledging that it's there, then there's a way to start to, in the earthquake, I call it the solution loop, to put yourself in a position where you can start to get some traction.
Help me understand that, Vince. So looking at fear, typically the response we've been told to deal with fear is don't ignore the fear. Fear isn't real.
Right. Well, here's a fact. When you run away from fear, it gets larger. When you run towards fear, it gets smaller. And that is not part of our human experience, is it? Like, if you run towards something, it gets bigger normally, but fear is insidious. It is, and it's obviously, when you get in the middle of it, the reason it gets smaller, you go, oh, I can handle this, so those fears correlate to being able to kind of go against your instinct, which is to run and hide, right? Because there's a part of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the oldest part of the brain, and it's quite small, about the size of a walnut, but that's the gatekeeper for thought, meaning that if you can't get past the amygdala, meaning let's say there's a tiger in the bushes somewhere, right? The amygdala is going to kick in to do one of three things. It's going to either freeze, that's the first instinct. The second instinct is to flight, to run away. And then the third instinct, which would kick, you got to get past these three. The third one is to fight. right? So freeze. Think of a rabbit in a field, right? A little bunny rabbit, and here's a predator, right? What does it do? It first freezes, and it just looks around, and hopefully you don't see me, you don't see me, you don't see me. If the predator sees the little bunny, the bunny's going to take off, right? And then if it's cornered, it's going to rear and then fight. Okay, none of those three responses as part of this human condition is going to be efficacious. There's going to be very little progress made if you freeze, flight, or fight. So the hack, by the way, in case you're wondering, let's say you get scared going on stage speaking to a bunch of people. The reason you've had a bad experience in the past and don't want to do it again is that you forgot to breathe. You're not breathing. And the trigger for the amygdala, the trigger for the freeze, flight, or flight, or fight, freeze, flight, or fight, is to lack of oxygen flow, which is shallow breathing. So when you're scared, like a scary movie, just notice what your breathing is. It's like, it's shallow. It's, oh no, what's going to happen? Right? And that is triggering the amygdala. Now, it's very safe in a movie theater to just be there. But if in real life, you're in any of those three states, you're not going to make progress. In fact, the opposite's you're going to get hurt. Something's going to, create a truth in the subconscious mind that this is not a good feeling, but maybe it becomes something like a lack of deservability, or there's all sorts of dysfunction that can happen from fear taking hold.
And yet fear's a vital part of our emotional being. It's the emotion that helps us survive, isn't it?
Yeah. Fear is really that first layer and that's the reason it's the first layer. Can I assess this situation and go into a cognitive response rather than what that means is a conscious thought instead of being entirely instinctive and reactionary, right? You're not going to make progress, generally speaking, by just being instinctive. So yeah, I mean, you can get in a fearful situation and say, I've got to preserve myself. I've got to stay alive. I've got to be able to do this. You're going to thrive when you are in conscious thought. You're going to just survive when you respond to that fear. So yeah, it's like flipping a switch and turning the lights on in the room. But then what are you going to do in that room? What is your next step? How are you going to progress, basically? So yeah, it's a good thing. I mean, if there was a flame on the other side of a door, that's a justifiable fear. I don't want to burn alive. So what's necessary for me to get through this? So yeah, I consider fear. I ran into Bruce Jenner. This was years and years and years ago. So obviously, and as two Olympians, he was obviously decorated and much more famous than I was. But we talked about fear, and he says, "Oh yeah, I used fear as my friend, right?" And all of a sudden, all these light bulbs went on because I did the exact same thing. So when I was training, for example, I would be doing 100 push-ups, for example. That's hard to do. But at about 90 push-ups, I would go, if I don't do 110 push-ups, I'm not going to get to the Olympic Games. So it would scare myself to push myself to do 10 extra, right? And so that's an innocuous kind of way to use fear to your own advantage, right? And just you make it your friend, not your enemy.
And I've heard of people who, when they just like you did there, they set themselves a goal, they promise themselves a reward if they make it, or a punishment if they don't.
Right. Yeah. Have you done that?
I have, yes. In fact, I was encouraged to do that by Peter Erst-Bender, who you may remember.
Yeah, I do remember Peter. Yeah, why not be the architect for our progress, right? Why not use every advantage in the human condition to your own advantage? And that's what Peter's talking about, right? Yes, you can have the aspirational notion of reaching a goal, of being rewarded by that, that's something that you aspire to creating or building or be a part of. But why not couple the anxiety or the stress or the fears attached to that, and you did both, right? What if you did both? How extraordinary would your motivation be? Right? So I'm with him on that one.
And I suppose in reflection, it's probably it's probably like getting the elephant on side.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, that's just it. And the goofy thing about this whole parable metaphor is it's subconscious, right? Sub meaning below consciousness. So we don't know exactly what's happening. Plus, the 2,000 neurons versus 4 billion neurons, we can't fully comprehend the awareness of the subconscious mind. It's as simple as imagining an ant on the back of an elephant. Now, does the ant see elephant, right? No, all it sees is a gray landscape with little black trees here, elephant hairs here and there, right? That's all it sees. And so our awareness can be limited to what's going on. For example, we've got a dog, his name's Cosmo, right? Cosmo, we've had him for 9 years. Pretty smart dog when you want him to do one thing or the other. But if I explained math to Cosmo, I said, Cosmo, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Cosmo would look at me like, what are you talking about, right? His awareness is limited because of this, how he thought process and how big his brain and all that. It's the same thing with the human condition. Our awareness of what's going on in the subconscious mind is impossible to comprehend in its entirety. It's impossible. But we have a certain amount of awareness that we can optimize. And I'm going to go to where you were kind of headed. How do you get that alignment between the ant and the elephant, right? And it's something that has an emotional buzz attached to it, meaning something that may not be realistic. For example, this, as you know, my Olympic story of at 26 years old, never ski raced before. At 30, I was vying for the gold medal in the Olympic Games in ski racing, right? At the beginning, that was not realistic. It was not even on the radar as possible, right? That was the conscious mind thinking that. So what I did was I embedded a truth in the subconscious mind that I was ranked 10th in the world. Now there's a whole presentation, a book about that. The Ant and the Elephant is that book. But to create that truth, then there's 4 billion neurons every second working on that truth, right? So you bypass the conscious mind's awareness of it because the awareness is limited. Cosmo doesn't understand math, but there is math. Right? So therefore, to create that issue for the subconscious mind then becomes something where it solidifies as a truth. And here's a fact: you'll gravitate to that which you believe to be true. I think that's Earl Nightingale's quote, come to think of it. You'll gravitate to that which you believe to be true. So why not be the truth for that, be the architect, for that truth?
And going back to the opening line of your book, there's no linear way out of chaos. How do we get the ant and the elephant working to get us out of chaos?
Yeah, it took an entire book. I brought it. It took an entire book to figure this. In fact, it took me 5 years to figure this out because it's chaos. Like, what is the prescriptive model that would work every time in chaos? Right? It's a tough question to answer, but in the book I call it the solution loop, and the enlightenment. I'll share the story of how the book, I finally came up with the solution loop, and I was just for 5 years poking at it, talking to people, talking to experts, talking to mentors, talking to gurus. And had lunch with Harville Hendrix, right? Harville wrote a New York Times bestseller. I don't know. He's on Oprah back in the day 19 times. He happens to live in Dallas. We happen to be friends. I said, Harville, could we just have lunch? And can I just ask you a few questions? He said, sure. And I said something about this issue of, what is the linear way out of chaos? And he said, oh, now he's a relationship guy, expert. And he goes, oh, it's all about relationships. And he says the ant and the elephant have a relationship. And all of a sudden, it was a realization. This was what set things in motion. Imagine, George, if you and I are in the same vehicle, but both of us have a steering wheel. And we think that if you just stop doing what you're doing with your steering wheel, I'll take care of us and get us there. But that's not the dynamic in the ant and the elephant. The ant is not just going to take over, and nor in the elephant, because it's 2 million times larger, can actually end up being in control and yanking the steering wheel. But the ant's also, or you are yanking your steering wheel and I'm yanking it, and we're not going back and forth. Here, let me take a turn and then you take a turn. That's not how the dynamic works with the conscious and subconscious mind. So the first fundamental step in the solution loop was to what I called grasp the contradiction, meaning there has to be a contradiction that's creating this dysfunction between your intention of where you want to go, get out of this earthquake, and the subconscious agenda, which has got some pain and avoidance and fears that are subconscious. Grasp that contradiction is misalignment, is meaning that they're out of alignment. The only way you and I, George, will get this vehicle working, because we're both in the vehicle and we both have a steering wheel, is to both of us let go of the steering wheel and create what Harville called it a third reality, meaning there's a third reality of way this vehicle can actually progress with the two of us in it. That is not immediately available, right? Then that flips you into saying, okay, if we're going to get this kind of alignment, what do we need to be curious about? Let's just be fundamentally curious about what kinds of solutions might be available that we've just never thought of before. Because here's another fact. What got you here won't necessarily get you there. I know that's a cliche, but we do that to ourselves. I did that to myself after this financial setback, financial earthquake, is I thought, well, I got to the Olympics. I got on the New York Times bestselling list. I got in the Speaker Hall of Fame. I got this, right? And I didn't comprehend that contradiction between my conscious and subconscious mind. And I had to, which was not fundamental to my DNA, is letting go, right? Letting go of that, what got you here, mindset, is to be able to let go and then allow a third reality. And that's where curiosity and creativity kicks in.
And Vince, what in that crisis, that earthquake for you, what was the fear that you had to run towards?
Oh, good question, George. The fear, well, there was two things at play, and one of them was I started to feel like I'd lost it, that I was irrelevant, that I was not capable to make it work anymore. And there was starting to be depression. There started to be all sorts of mental health issues. And I was never suicidal, but I was sliding into oblivion. And so the fears would have been associated with that I'd lost it, that I was not capable anymore, that, and other things kick in, like envy and jealousy and just the insidious nature of uncertainty. And so I guess fear was just, it's got sticky hands and fear just gets in there and just sticks to things, so yeah, it took a while. It took years, actually.
And Vince, I'm wondering, I think most of us have gone through a situation where we set a goal and then we keep failing because we're subconsciously sabotaging ourselves.
Yeah.
And have you seen that?
Oh yeah, I did it. I sabotaged myself all the time. Procrastination. There's a keeper, right? Uh, we there's a guy that I follow. His name is Dr. George Burris, and Dr. Burris, talks about something called your path, and your path might not be working for you, but it's your path. It's your place of comfort, even though it may be dysfunctional. And so we do whatever we can to get back onto the path. And that's the subconscious mind believing that that's where we belong. And so think of somebody in an abusive relationship, right? There was all sorts of butterflies and rainbows at the beginning of that relationship. There was all sorts of stuff that was just irresistible. I mean, the attraction and the connection, and this is the one. But all of a sudden, this abuse starts to occur. And then the mind starts to make sense of it, saying, oh, this is my path. This is where I belong. And to get away from your path can be a very, very difficult thing. But let me add this one short story, because this is where the value of an outside perspective is absolutely essential. You and I both know a guy named Dr. John Gray. He wrote a book called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. John and I had become friends over the years, and he, this is such a story. So his dad was carjacked and left to die in the trunk of a car in Tyler, Texas in August. The heat exhaustion just overtook him, and his dad died in this trunk. John and his brother went to the funeral in Tyler. They went to the impound lot to see the car. John and his brother, John's not a very tall guy, he's about 5'5". And he said, I want to get in the trunk and see what Dad went through. And his brother went, all right. And so John got in, they closed the trunk, and they could see how, by the way, they tested this and opened the door with the button to allow the BMW trunk to open. So John got in, and then he could see how his dad had tried to pry open the latch with the crowbar that was in there. He could tell that his dad had punched out the tail light, and John, not a very tall guy, reached his arm out the tail light and tried to open the trunk himself. And he realized why his dad couldn't reach it, because it was just impossible to reach the button. And then John heard his brother's voice on the outside of the car. And the heat was getting dangerously bad in the trunk. And he heard his brother's voice say, just angle your hand in and up, just in and up. And he found the button, pressed it, and the trunk lid opened, and in washed fresh air and survival. And John said these exact words. It was at that point I realized I would never underestimate the value of an outside perspective. The reason I bring that up is when you are on a path, it becomes sometimes impossible to realize that it's a path that's not working for you. And to have an outside perspective of somebody like Dr. George Burris say, this is the path that's not working for you. What choices do you want to make? Where do you choose to be? And so now we're dealing with patterns of a path and a choice of being in a different place. The fundamental way to make that happen is to attach an emotional buzz about what this new path could create. And how we started this interview, what if it was a synthesis? What if it was a joining of the aspirational nature of this, where this new path could take you, but also what you would never have to experience again, and put those things, interlink those things together. Then you're on a new path to get out of this. And here's a kicker. We're in a world based on instant gratification. So it may take a while, and we're not fundamentally used to delaying gratification nowadays, are we?
No, not at all. Yeah. And Vince, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that this is this is an episode that listeners are going to want to listen to more than one time because there's a lot of lot of thought in there, a lot of thinking.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing there is that we always need someone else.
Yes. Yes. The value of an outside perspective. Never underestimate the value of an outside perspective. And it could be a friend. This is such an interesting time, George, I think we're in, because mental health has been destigmatized in a way. Athletes at the top of their game, Olympians, football players, people that are supposed to be these pillars of strength are going, I don't feel right and I need help, right? And they've said this publicly, Michael Phelps. Everybody it was so eye-opening when Michael Phelps said, I don't feel right, I need help. And everybody's going, wait, you just won 29 Olympic medals and you're saying you need help? I mean, we weren't allowed to do that as Olympians or athletes or any of us, that are supposed to be strong. Dads, father, a husband. I mean, there's stuff that maybe we feel we shouldn't share. And maybe that's just our generation. The younger generation is leading the way, saying, Simone Biles, saying, you know what, I'm not gonna compete in this round. If you remember the last Olympics, but she had the courage to, with all the pressure on her, all the cameras and the microphones, and she said, yeah, I'm feeling fragile. Whatever she was feeling, she was honest about mental health. So it's easier today to find that new path that will serve you better into that uncertainty.
And Vince, so do we need to become more aware of our emotional states, and do we always listen? Or how do we decide when to listen to the emotion, especially when the emotion's something like anger?
Yeah. Let's simplify it and call them soul taps. And there are moments where you get a tap on the shoulder, and all that means is pay attention, right? Just be aware. And it's so much more enhanced when you can pay attention with an outside perspective. I have a coach. I have a coach that Steve Strauss is his name. And do you know Steve?
No.
Yeah. Steve Strauss is here in Dallas, and he's just been my coach for close to 20 years now. And it's that outside perspective that I'm constantly checking in with, Yeah. Important.
And Vince, for people who want to know more about you, your services, and especially your books, the place to find out more is at your website.
Yeah, vinceposcente.com. Yeah.
And you can find that link in the description below. Vince, as we prepare to wrap up, if you could sit down and give advice to a team leader who is experiencing some sort of chaos, maybe it's a massive loss in business and they've got to lay people off. Maybe it's a project that's failed, or maybe it's just something in their personal life that's gone terribly wrong. If you could give them 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice to find a way out of chaos that's probably not going to be obvious to them.
Yeah, I would say the number one thing, because this is a painful thing. For example, what you're experiencing, if you're going through that, imagine if there was a knife in your leg, right? And somebody said, well, just let go, just allow, just don't have fear, just don't think about it. It's like, no, there's a knife in my leg. And so the process necessary to take care of this pain is going to have to be directed towards that pain to then make the next step for the long game. So I guess this is a weird metaphor I haven't used before, but if you had a knife in your leg and you've been able to extract it and stop the bleeding, now you're in the long game. You are not going to take a pill and feel better. You're not going to not limp. You're going to have severed muscles. I mean, but the long game will eventually be something where it's going to get better. And then the third piece, which is the reason we're having such fallout from the pandemic, is we have been connected, like you and I are connected here digitally, but getting back with groups and seeing people connected and seeing people pushing back against going into the office and all that. I get that because it's more convenient. In 1981, Faith Popcorn came up with a book called Cocooning, a concept called Cocooning, which ended up being a book. And she was watching people become more and more isolated. And with technology, back then it was VHS, where you could take a movie home. Well, I don't need to go out. I can stay in the home. All these, now we got delivery, we got Amazon. I mean, she didn't even know that was on the radar. But this isolationism became more and more convenient, and we're creatures of what? Habit. And so this is the long answer to say that we have gone so far. The pandemic made us, put us in a box. And then now we're kind of used to that this is a new path. It's not necessarily functional to be connected one-on-one with people. That infuses connection with communication, and these immutable byproducts of just being face to face with somebody, to being connected, to care, to make eye contact, to have visual cues. I mean, all this stuff puts us in a better place. So I would say address it, go straight towards it, play the long game, and then stay connected on many, many different levels.
Valuable advice there, Vince. My guest today is Vince Poscente, reminding you that there's no linear way out of chaos.
If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.